Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, DevExtreme ASP.NET MVC Wrappers, presented by Web Program Manager Mehul Harry. In today's session, Mehul will introduce you to the new DevExtreme ASP.NET MVC Wrappers, and you'll learn what's possible with the MVC extensions, how to get started with them, and more. FYI, this session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul.
Thank you, Amanda. Welcome, everybody. Today, we're talking about ASP.NET MVC Wrappers. It's a new line of controls from the DevExtreme suite, even though it's related to ASP.NET. All right, so as Amanda mentioned, I am Mehul Harry. I am the Web Program Manager, and typically you've known me from all the ASP.NET stuff. But in general, I work with all sorts of stuff, but in general, all over the web stack. So today's is very interesting because MVC Wrappers, now I liked this one's tweet, although I don't agree. I think ASP.NET MVC is actually awesome. And today's is very interesting because the wrappers take a concept from DevExtreme, which, if you're not familiar, is our client-side library. So if you go to js.devexpress.com, and yes, JS is for JavaScript, if you go there, you'll find our client-side controls. These are completely client-side, meaning that they are written with HTML5, JavaScript, CSS. They can run on any web server, on any OS, essentially, because they just strictly run on the web. They don't require any particular framework. And some people love them. You know, if you are a client-side developer, if you love JavaScript, you will love what these controls can bring you. So what we've done, though, is a lot of customers said, hey, you know, we like your current set of ASP.NET MVC extensions. Now, currently, we have 50 ASP.NET MVC extensions. Now, these are great. They provide things like spreadsheets and pivot grids, all sorts of good stuff. However, these were built with a different code base. These were built with our web forms code base at the heart of them, which gives some advantages, like you have similar feature sets, and when you introduce one control in web forms, it's also available in this MVC set. However, the web is very different out there. There's all kinds of developers out there. So what we wanted to do, we wanted to provide a different option to our customers that said, hey, take what you know from this client-side control. Now, when I say client-side, these controls are rendered from the server side, meaning that the current ASP.NET MVC extensions are native MVC extensions, but the rendering happens from the server side. And eventing happens like you would expect in typical ASP.NET. With client-side controls, it's a different thing altogether. These are delivered. The JavaScript HTML is delivered to the browser, and then most everything happens in the browser. So for example, as much as possible, all operations like this scrolling here. So that scrolling happened on the client side. However, that data that it went to fetch may have gotten, it did happen on the server, because in this case we're talking to web service. But in essence, things like moving columns around, whatever is possible on the client side, will do that. And so this is a big trend in a lot of websites these days, because saving a round trip back to the server is really useful. It's really important for your end users to have that nice experience. Okay, so what we did was we took this client-side library and created wrappers. Now, what that means, it's a terrible name, but as this paper company will tell you, you know, wrappers shouldn't necessarily just be some guy that you imagine. Wrappers are that. In the development space, a wrapper essentially means we have taken the client-side control and wrapped it as a ASP.NET MVC extension. So for example, instead of seeing this code here where we've got JavaScript, now we get a server-side HTML control, and now we can use Razor to create this. So there's some key advantages to this, and I want to show you all of those today. Okay, the first thing I should mention is in 16.1, this is a CTP, a Community Technology Preview. And I'll get more into about its status later, but in general, it's baked enough that you can start playing with it, you can use it. However, there's still some big features we want to add, and we're working on that, and it's going to happen by the next major release. Okay, so what do you get by using MVC wrappers? And out of the box, you'll get things like support for Globalize, and you'll get Visual Studio support, and you'll get support for Bootstrap, and of course, as I mentioned, the client-side JavaScript. Now, these things, first three things, are already supported. Now, yes, the current set of MVC extensions also supports Visual Studio, but what I mean is, in this release, we've added some particular things specifically for the MVC wrappers in Visual Studio. Now, Globalize is a library that helps you do localization, and that's been supported by the client-side widgets already, so you get that baked in. Bootstrap support, we've recently, if you saw the What's New webinar for DevExtreme, we've added better support for Bootstrap in this release, and you'll see that we've got some good file new experience in Visual Studio with Bootstrap that you're really going to appreciate. All right, let's see what this all means. Now, the first thing you might ask is, okay, this is all great, and I definitely want you to stay and watch the whole webinar before you go and say, let me go dive right into it. So where do you download this stuff? Well, in this release, you're going to have to download DevExtreme Complete. Now, this is the installer, the executable installer that you get from your DevExpress download my products link at the top. And I'm not logged in, but when you log in, you get that. Or download the trial for 16.1. But in essence, once you download it, you will get a folder. Now, if you go to your C folder, in fact, let's just do that. We'll go to C, Users, Public, and under my Documents, I will find DevExpress Demos 16.1. And here, under DevExtreme, is a new sample application we created. It's called ASP.NET Wrappers CTP. And if you look under MVC5, this is compiled with the MVC5, and this now will have a sample application that we call, it's just kind of like a widgets gallery, that has nearly all of the widgets that are available. So let's take a look at this. Now, if I open this up inside my Visual Studio, you can see I've got a solution here that has most everything in it. So the first thing I like to do is just look at this in the browser. So let's just run this right in our browser. Now here you can see that as it'll come up right up, we've got all of the major widgets as MVC extensions. So that what we wanted to show you is that this is how you get started with them. So people typically have an application, a question that says, okay, great, I want to use your client-side controls that are now wrapped in MVC as extensions. So for example, what is it like to use the pivot grid? Well, this sample application can show you. And for example, here in the data grid, I've got a data grid that I can easily sort, I can filter, I can do edit, saves, all that good stuff. You can experience also what it feels like to use them. Now, of course, once we fully release this in the future versions, we'll actually have these demos online. For now, though, we put them locally just so you can play around them in your own Visual Studio. But what's great is, you know, all of the DevExtreme widgets are available. So, for example, we've got these client-side charts that have these really nice animations, gauges as well. So all the data visualization widgets, all of the editors that support validation, file upload, all sorts of great things, including our excellent scheduler widget as well. So all of these are available to you. Now, while that is great, what I really want to show you today, and a large portion of what we're going to talk about today, is in Visual Studio, and I want to walk you through what it's like to get started with these. What's the difference, right? Now, you've seen plenty of webinars with Julian and Paul where they walk you through DevExtreme from file new and even make a mobile app and all so forth. I want to walk you through the Visual Studio approach of this. So to do this, I'm going to tell you how to get started. Now, to do this, we have provided to you a file new experience in Visual Studio. So if you go file new project, you will see under Templates, under Web, a DevExtreme MVC5 application template. Now, if we click OK, what you'll see is it's going to create. Now, there's no wizards or anything, and that's because we made some choices by default. And in this project template, we only provide one so far, and that's because we just said, okay, what's the most likely scenario? And in the most likely scenario, you're going to want to see something that out of the box provides some default functionality. So we made it light enough, but it has some content in there. So of course you can see we've got some icons in there, font icons that we use, but more importantly, you'll see right away that we've got some Bootstrap built into it. And that's because in this project template, we use Bootstrap in the same way that Microsoft uses Bootstrap in their File New Project templates. And then, of course, we've got some other great items. So I'll get more into that in a minute, but first, let's just take a look at this in the browser. So out of the box, as I mentioned, we do have support for Bootstrap. So if I start resizing this, you can see, keep an eye on the top menu here, as Bootstrap does, once it starts collapsing, running out of space, it starts making some choices. So it started giving us a hamburger menu and put the items in there. And you can see the grid itself is responsive. Now, this is just built right into it. But what's also great is inside of this File New application, we give you a grid just to show you what it's like to render the grid and how easy it is. And I've got 50 rows. And as I click through the grid, you can see I've got some nice rendering coming out of it. I can I can sort by different columns. I can sort by multiple columns if I want to. All sorts of different things can happen. And the filtering options are also built right in as well. Okay, so that's great. But let's take a look a little deeper and understand a couple of the key things that are different from how you might experience this from ASP.NET MVC as you know it today from DevExpress. Now, the very first thing is because these are client-side controls that are wrapped, meaning at their core, they're still client-side controls. But in Visual Studio, you get to work with them. So if I go to Views here, and let me just collapse some of these items here. So of course, we've got Globalize, and we've got some other items from DevExtreme that we need. So if we take a look under Views, Home, and I look at the main view, you can see we're rendering for you a data grid. So this data grid essentially is the DevExtreme data grid. But now, as you can see, I can call the HTML helper that we've created that lets us do this. So how do you create HTML helpers for yourself? Well, it's actually quite easy. So for example, here, if I want, I can simply come in here and declare, let's declare a new button. So we'll come in here, we'll say html.devextreme, and let's call it button. So just like that, I've got a button. Now what if I want to add some text to it? I can simply go text. Now as you see, I'm using the ASP.NET, well first of all I'm getting IntelliSense from Visual Studio, which is great. And I've got that Fluent syntax that I can start typing with using Razor syntax. So if you're a fan of ASP.NET and Razor, you're absolutely going to love this new approach. I know I do. So now for the text, let's just call it something like click me. Now, if that's all we really need to do. And now when I run it, I've got myself a little button. And as you can see, this little bit of Razor code, if we take a look, let's take a look. In fact, I haven't shown you yet how this is. One of its key differences is that it is very simple. So our button is simply a div. And again, this is a concept that a lot of developers really liked, is that the rendering with these client-side widgets, it's a little bit more semantic, it's a little bit more modern, and it provides, again, some very simple markup. And I'll get into more of this in just a little bit. Okay, so, but let's take a look back at the grid now. In the grid, we've got things that we've, properties that we've set for it. So for example, we've got show borders, I've defined some columns, paging, and so forth, and we've even created a summary. But how does data binding work? Well, that is a key, that's a very good question. So let's do this. In fact, I'm gonna, let's keep track here. Let's add a little comment here. And so far, we've taken a look at File New. And then we've done Create a Widget. Next, let's talk about data binding. Now, this is important because data binding is very different in client-side controls. Why? Well, when you're working on the server side, everything exists on the server side. Not only does your rendering and code exist on the server side, but so does your database. But now, when it's working on the client side, you either have to have the data locally on the client side, or you need to create a web service that talks back to it. So how does data binding work when you have a server-side extension that is really wrapping a client-side widget that needs to talk back to the server side? Well, let's explore that. Well, in this example, what are we doing? We've got something called data source. Now, I don't want to diminish this because our devs have done something really interesting here. They have provided a special data source for these extensions that allows you to bind to local data on the client side or a web service on the server side, and it really simplifies it. In fact, we've got some of this stuff. I believe we're going to put this stuff on our GitHub page as well, but it's as part of this DevExpress and so forth. But anyways, we'll talk more about that in the future once this is all released. But what's interesting is if we take a look here, it's calling something in the controllers called orders. So let's take a look at our controllers, at orders. So the first thing I'll notice is in the orders controller, it is not deriving from the default controller, it's deriving from API controller. So what that means is this is creating for us an API controller, meaning that we are now creating a RESTful service. And here we can use simple calls like HTTP gets, puts, and so forth. And I believe there's a total of, for example, about 7 attributes that you can actually put on there. Now, I'll put a link to this later, but you know, this is important because when you create a RESTful service, you want to be able to support this. So Microsoft's API controller in the most recent versions is really nice for that. Now, we're doing a simple get. So the get is calling our data source, and it's loading something called sample data. So let's take a look at sample data in our orders. So sample data, as we see here, is simply a static list that we're defining. So it's basically those 50 rows of data. So we've got some JSON data here that essentially is binding, but it's happening all, for example, on the server. We're not connecting to any database. Now you might say, well, that's not typical. Typically, I'd want to expose it from my database. How do you do that? Well, let's see. So what I want to walk you through is using Entity Framework, how to add your own data to this. So let's do that. So the first thing is we want to use Entity Framework. Now, the way to use Entity Framework these days is added via NuGet. So if I right-click on my project, and of course you can go from the Tools menu as well, but if I right-click on my project and I go Manage NuGet Packages, you're going to get this if you're using Visual Studio 2015, which you don't have to. I just prefer it. But in Visual Studio 2015, if I go to Browse and I search for Entity, I will get the top result should typically be Microsoft's Entity Framework. Now, it's a little bit slow here, so let's just give it a sec. Okay, NuGet may be down. So NuGet is still down. Nope. Okay, so NuGet is back. All right, so let's. I'm just going to back it up a little bit here. Now, you don't have to use this approach with NuGet as well. I should mention as well that you can go and use the NuGet Package Manager console. Now, the Package Manager console will allow you to do something like install package, and you can put in like Microsoft and Entity Framework, and you can, I'm just using a tab here, and it's going to start finding those items for me. So essentially, you can use either of those approaches. I tend to prefer this package thing here. So I've gone back just to kind of show you all the steps, right? In this file new experience, we have a static list collection here, and I want to add Entity Framework to it so I can start talking to the database. Now, when I search for entity framework, for each type entity, you're going to find this top result here, and it's by Microsoft, and you want to grab the latest stable version. And once you click install, it's going to ask you, do you want to add this to your current MV6 App 6 project? And yes, I do. So I'll click OK, and then it's ask you to agree and accept the license, which I will. And once you do, it's going to download all of the existing items, update your references, all that good stuff. And again, whenever I get something new in a package, I like to make sure and recompile it. All right, so now that we've got entity framework in here, let's go ahead and add that model that I mentioned before. So if I right-click and add a new ADO.NET entity data model, and it's similar to what I showed before, we'll go to Northwind, select the entity framework designer, and point to our database, whatever it may be. Now, in this case, I don't have a connection defined, so I'll put in dot, which is same as localhost /SQL Express, and point to Northwind. Now, I'll do a similar thing where I'll go and take a look at the orders table. Now, I select orders because, as you can see, we've already got an order that we're defining, but we got it against local data. But let's use the one from Northwind. Now, once I bring it in, it's doing the same thing. It's creating that designer for us, and the designer allows us to modify any changes and so forth. So it's a really nice little designer. I can go in, I can bring in another table and link all sorts of stuff, but I don't want to do that. What I just want to do right now is change what I'm pointing to. So the first thing is, now that I have this model, I don't need sample data. So I'm going to delete sample data altogether. Let's get rid of our static collection. And if you've used Entity Framework before, you'll know to instantiate an Entity Framework, you need to create this DB context. So in our case, it's called Northwind Entities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and create an instance, and I'll call it _nwind and call it new Northwind Entities. Okay, now I have the Northwind Entities. All I need to do is replace this orders from that pointed to sample data over with this one from Northwind Entities. I'm not going to change my data source here at all because I'm still binding to the same controller. I'm still calling the same get, but inside the get, where I'm getting the data is changed. I'm no longer going to that static collection. I'm going against Entity Framework and getting the list of orders. So let's take a look at this in our browser. Okay, so if we bring this back up, and I'll refresh this, and currently we had 50 rows. So now we should get 831 rows. So now we've got the full set of rows from our database. So I can go all the way to the last page, the first page. You can see it's fast. And I can do things like sorting, as I mentioned before. Now, let's take a look and make sure with that we've got some errors coming up, so we'll take a look at those as well. So we may not have binded completely correctly. So let's take a look and see what's happening in our code base here. So the first thing is, I've got something called customer name here. Now, if I take a look at my order from Entity Framework, I don't have customer name. I can bring in the customers table, but you know, I don't really want to do that. So what I'm going to do instead is I can just delete that, or I can just comment it out. So now, when I bind this, you can see just by commenting out a little bit of code, I can easily update this. And then I've got that same field. So what's great is I've got a grid. It's rendering client-side. Now, I mentioned client-side, and I want to make sure you understand how this essentially works. So let's take a look a little bit at the browser tools. Now, if I go to the Network tab and I click on the second page, you can see I've got a call here. So let's inspect this call here. And you can see I'm getting simply just the JSON. It is not re-rendering the grid at all. I'm only getting the data, which is very slick, as you can see, right? And it's how you expect it to work. And it's smart enough to only get the 10 records that I need here. So what's happening is we've got a special mode here that knows that I'm working with a web API service. So if we go back to Visual Studio here and we take a look, I've got something called remote operations. Now, what are remote operations? Well, it's a way to tell the grid that, hey, listen, if I'm working with remote data on a server, I want you to use these remote operations. And it's kind of similar to our server mode if you're familiar with that from our other products. But in essence, it knows what data to get and whether you're sorting and so forth. But let's say I disable this. And let's see what happens. Now, if we go back and I'll refresh our grid here. Now, if we take a look, and if I go to the second page or so forth, actually, if we take a look at this here, the initial call, you can see I downloaded all of the data. You can see I went and got all 831 rows. So that doesn't make sense because I'm not working with this data locally. So typically, if you're going to work with your data locally, that means you've downloaded this with a local database, then you want to turn off remote operations. Otherwise, I would definitely recommend leaving remote operations on. Okay. Now, that's all great, but what about working with, when you're working with data, you typically want to be able to edit the data. So let's take a quick look here. Now, we'll talk about editing because editing is built right into our grid, and it's a very nice, easy way to do it. And by showing you editing, I also want to show you how to sort of customize some properties. So you saw already we can declare properties, and we can use this Fluent syntax. So what about if you wanted to add, let's say, a new row? Well, to do that, you can simply come into your DevExtreme grid and start using that Fluent syntax and simply ask it to allow editing. Now, to do this, we're going to come down here. I'm going to type in editing, and using that Fluent syntax, I'll simply say, hey, listen, I want to use, and here, as you can see, you can simply go allow editing and set it to true. Now, once I did that, let's see what happens to our grid. Just by adding that, I get a little plus button. But what happens if I click the plus button? Well, I get the option to save a new row. So what happens if I save the new row? It tells me, hey, you cannot do this because you don't support post. That means you don't have any way to save back. You haven't handled that logic. So if we come back here and if we take a look at our controller, it's absolutely right. We're only handling a get. So how do we actually save this data back? Well, we have to first of all handle that method. So how do we do that? Well, let's come in here and manage that. So I'm going to add a little bit of code here so we can understand how to save back and use our entity framework. So in this bit of code, what we're doing is we're adding something that allows us to insert a new record, which is obviously going to be an HTTP post. And in it, on the post method, we're taking form data collection. Now, first of all, I'm getting a red squiggly from Visual Studio, so let's fix that error. I'll click that fix, and it says, hey, you need to be using systemnet HTTP formatting. All right, great. We got that now. Get rid of that. And in it, our form is essentially our data row. So our data row here is what's going to be passed back to this method. And this form has values property in it. And that values property is actually a JSON object. So we're going to collect that into a local variable called values. And then we're going to create an instance of our order. So we create it using that entity data model that we created called order. And then we're going to map it. So again, let's fix this squiggly here, and we're probably missing a using clause. And yes, we're going to add this Newton soft.json. And essentially, populate object takes care of that mapping for us. So it takes the items from this JSON object, which is passed in through our form, and maps it to our local order. And then, of course, we want to validate that object. So we call validate, and if everything is valid on the model state, or if it, in this particular case, if it is not valid, we're going to throw up an error message. Now again, I've got a squiggly here, and this doesn't have an easy fix because why? It's a message that I'm posting back, and I haven't defined that message. So let me go ahead and define that message for us. So we're going to come up here, and I'll create a message that says, hey, listen, you can't save this object because you got some kind of validation error. But if all goes well, we pass the validation, then we're simply going to add it to the orders collection, and using entity framework, we're going to save the changes and send a proper request code, a 201. Of course, if it doesn't work, we'll send a 400, which is a bad request. So again, it's using RESTful API, and it's very nice, and it talks right to the grid that way. All right, let's compile this, and let's run it in the browser. Now that we've got it wired up, I can hit our plus sign and add a new row. So let's do that. I'm going to come up here. I'm going to say plus, and just for differentiation, I'll put in something like 2222 and pick like today's date and country. I'll put it all caps, France, and I'll put in Lyon, and then I'll put save. Now let's find it, 2222, and it goes, wait, you're like, what happened? Well, you know, if we take a look, typically I'd expect a new row to be at the end. So let's go to the last page. Oh, there's our record. There's the record I just created, but why is it not using the number I gave? Well, I do remember that this table is auto-incremented, so I don't want this to be editable. So again, this is a easy fix for us using our excellent Razor syntax. So I can simply come in here, and I want to say allow editing, and I'll say, oops, false in lowercase. Now we can simply run this again, and if I try to edit this record, if I add a new record, you'll see I can't click on it at all. It does not allow me because it's non-editable. It simply says don't worry about this, just ignore it. All right, that's great. But what if I want to do editing? What if I want to do other CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete operations? Well, that's easy. I can keep using this Fluent syntax and say, hey, now allow updating and set it to true, and allow deleting, set it to true. And now you can see why using Fluent syntax in Razor is really nice, really simple, and very easy to configure. Just by adding this, I've now allowed full editing on this data grid. But if you remember from adding, we actually haven't added this code. So let's go ahead and bring in that code as well. So the update is going to be very similar to our adding, as we'll see in a minute. So if you come down here, you can see our in updating is using HTTP put, and again, it's doing the same thing. We've got a form collection, but in this case, we're going to use the key, and then we're going to find that key in the orders, and then do the same thing. Map the values, make sure it's valid, save the changes back, and send the proper code. Delete simply needs to find the key and then remove that from the collection, and of course, save that changes back. All right, so let's take a look at this in the browser. And now we'll see that we'll go ahead to the final page as soon as it comes up, and let's say I want to edit this. Now, just by the way, by allowing editing option in the grid, I'm sorry, allow updating option in the grid, I get this command column. Or if I enable delete as well, I get this command column that puts those command buttons in there for me. It's a really nice feature. Now, when I hit edit, it doesn't allow me to edit this because it's not an editable field, but I can come in here, I can put in something like the 23rd or last week or something. I can change this to USA, and I can put in something like Los Angeles, and when I hit save, I've got that information saved back. Whether I go to this row, whether I go that row, you can see it's updated it back. And if I want, I can delete it as well. And again, this is another reason why you might want to use this grid, is that it's got these really nice UI features built right in. When I hit delete, you'll see that it's making this option modal. It's giving me a modal pop-up that says, hey, you must decide on an option because you want to delete this. Are you sure you want to delete this record? Because once you do, it's a destructive item. So it's telling me, and so now that data row has gone. So again, really nice UI features built right in. Okay. Finally, let's go back to our Visual Studio here and talk a little bit about, we've covered editing. Now let me just cover something called events. Oops, events. Now, this, if you're familiar with ASP.NET, you'll know that's one of its strengths of ASP.NET. It's because it's server-side, things happen on the server side. But in the client-side world, things don't happen on the server side. So how does eventing work? Well, events typically work on the client side. So you can't do the same thing. So JavaScript events, because this lives in the client side, you have to handle events on the client side. And even though these are wrapped, even though this is a Razor object, we can't actually write a server-side event because this is, again, the advantage is that you get things happening on the client side, and therefore this is where JavaScript comes up. Now, you know, I tend to make fun of JavaScript and how there's so many frameworks out there, and you can do lots of fun, crazy things with the web, you know, web development these days. But don't worry, you know, JavaScript will definitely shake your confidence until you realize it was just a simple typo and things are actually not so bad. So I don't want you to fear JavaScript, and I'll show you why. So let's take, for example, our button object here, because there's multiple ways you can actually go about it. Now, you might, by the way, I just want to reassure you, everything I'm showing you today code-wise, everything that I'm talking about, there's a guide for in our documentation as well. So fear not, I'll have a blog post after this. So let's talk about how do we do client side. So there's a number of ways you can actually handle it on the client side. And as I mentioned, there are some guides for this as well. So let's start with the typical approach of just using a simple inline function. So if I wanted to add a click to our button, right now it says click me, but it doesn't actually do anything. So if I wanted to, I can come in here and I can say, hey, listen, I want to create a, let's say, on click. Now, I can come in here and define a anonymous function. It's got no name, and it's got some advantages being an anonymous function. And if you want to learn more about anonymous functions, please check out Julian's JavaScript webinars from before. He goes into all sorts of things about JavaScript. All right, so we got a simple anonymous function, and in it we're going to do the good old alert. And this allows us to simply say, hey, listen, you know, I was clicked, let's say, and of course put in our semicolon. And now let's take a look at this. Let's bring up the right browser here and go back. All right, so now let's just refresh this. If I hit click me, I've got my little alert. I was clicked. And now it's as simple as that, right? To handle an event, you're going to bind it in a similar way. But as you can see, we've exposed them via Razor. So via Razor, I can do this. Now, the three ways I want to talk about, though, is that, yes, you can come in here and either do an inline function, which I just inlined, or we can get a little trickier and say, you know what, I want to do more than just this one function, right? So what we want to do is let's go and remove and put this guy in its own script block, because we're going to do more than just an alert. So if I wanted to, I can come in here and I'm going to call it, I'm going to create a function called my button click. Now this button click doesn't exist yet, so let's go ahead and create it. So if I create a script block here, I can paste our function. So now I can bring this out, but it's no longer going to be anonymous. In fact, it's going to be my button click. So my button click is now an extra bit of code. Now, why would you do this? There's various reasons. Maybe you want it in a separate file, or you've got a lot of code, or it's up to you. Typically, if it's simple, I might just inline it or something like that. Okay, but let's say we're going to do something more in here, and we'll console log something here. We'll console log, button clicked, and of course we'll put in our semicolon. Now take a look at this in the browser. I'm not sure why I'm compiling it. It's just JavaScript. I don't need to. So let's go back to our thing here and refresh this. And now, if we take a look at this, of course we got this, I was clicked, but we're not going to see the console log unless we open up our developer tools and look at console, and there's our button clicked message as well. Okay, so that's all fine and dandy. But in Razor, there's another way to do it. And this is a way you might actually prefer, and that's using the text tag. So instead of creating this, and I think it's kind of like, I won't say best of both worlds, but it's a different approach. So for example, we can come in here and I can create what we call the at text, and it's actually in here, text. So text allows us to enter just about anything inside of those items, whether it's actually simply text or what we might put in that JavaScript function. So now let's take this bit of block code, remove our script altogether, and we'll put it inside here. Now, if you love your indenting, just manually handle that. But now that I'm back in here, I don't need my button click. I can convert it back to an anonymous function. So as you can see, it's got some advantages as well. So now let's save this, and out of habit, I'll keep rebuilding, and then of course I will refresh this, and let's take a look at our browser tools again. And once I hit click me, I was clicked, and we get our console log message as well. Okay, very nice, very easy. Now, just to show you that this can go a little further, let me add another quick widget to this, just to kind of recap. I've got the HTML helper method, I've got DevExtreme, and this time let's create a pop-up. So in the pop-up, I simply want to add an item. Now, in fact, let me talk a little bit about the last thing I was going to mention, which is templates, and that's what I'm going to use with the pop-up. So the pop-up allows me to, just as the button allows me to define text, the pop-up allows me to define what's in the pop-up. I can put in some text. In fact, let's do that. Let's put in some text in our pop-up. To do that, I'm going to actually use the content template property. So if I come in here, and if you take a look here, we got a content template. Now, this content template allows me to define just about anything in there. So if I come in here, I can do the same thing that I did with Razor. I can use its text, and if I can close it off properly, I can now put just about anything I want in that text property. So let's define in our text property something just kind of like, this is my pop-up. All right. Now, I've got the content template, oops, and I want to make sure that I've got the right amount of parentheses here. Right. Okay, so these are the items in our content template. And now, let's take a look at this. Now, to do that, though, I'm not actually popping this pop-up anymore. I've just defined a pop-up. So why don't we use our excellent little button here? So instead of just putting up messages and console logging things, let's use a little bit of jQuery. Now, DevExtreme does support jQuery out of the box, so those libraries are included, as is most of Microsoft project templates. And you can simply just go $. Now, right now, $, and I can use, what jQuery is really great at is finding elements and calling events on them and stuff. But right now, how am I going to call this pop-up? I actually haven't defined any way to call it. So let's use our excellent little Razor syntax again and add an ID property to this. Now, if you're going to be using calling elements on the page, you want to give them identifiers. So in this case, I am going to be calling my pop-up. So let's label it my pop-up. And now, using jQuery, I can come back here and say, hey, listen, find my pop-up. And once you do, it is a call its DX pop-up show method. Now again, that sample application I talked about earlier with Widgets Gallery has all of this and more, as I'll show you in just a little bit. Okay, so now we've got our button wired up to call this pop-up. So let's take a look at this again, and I will just refresh this guy. Now, once I hit click me, I've got my little pop-up and it says, hey, this is my pop-up. Now what's really great is that it's very customizable. In this content template, I can put just about anything in there. So for example, let's say I want to take this grid and pop it in there. So let's do that. Instead of saying that message, I'm going to put our grid in there. And now let's take a look at this back in the browser and refresh this guy. Now our grid is gone. If I hit click me, there's our grid and there's our same great item right there. All right, so just to recap, today we've covered everything from the file new experience to how simple it is to create a widget using the HTML helper on the DevExtreme, and then data binding. Using Entity Framework, you can bind to an entity, and you saw how easy it is to call that. And then we took a look at editing, how you can customize properties very easily by simply using that Fluent syntax in Razor to define items. For example, I can define a base page size if I want. I can turn off grouping if I want. I can enable header filter if I want. So there's all sorts of great options you can easily customize. Again, these properties also correspond to existing items that you find on DevExtreme. So if you want, you can take a look at our DevExtreme pages under documentation. Now, if you do go to documentation, as I mentioned before, if you click documentation guides, you'll find a whole section on MVC wrappers that covers everything that I talked about today, from fundamentals to data binding and so forth. And I'll get back to this in just a second. But and to finally wrap it up, we took a look at events, because events happen on the client side. You will need to talk a little bit JavaScript, but this is the advantage of using the DevExtreme MVC wrappers, is that if you like having client-side functionality, client-side controls, but you like Razor syntax as well, you get the best of both worlds here. And finally, templates. Templates are super powerful, let you do all sorts of things like customize any which way you want, and a lot of our widgets provide that. Now, I recommend go through this fun new example that I've walked you through, and you can also take a look at that widgets gallery that's provided in that demos directory that I mentioned before. And if you take a look at it, if you take a look at the data grid, not only does it show what we talked about today with custom binding, but it goes further. It shows you how to do master detail. And again, it also uses template. It's got a grid bound in there as well. And how to do data binding with it. For example, we've got the data source with an API controller. So if we take a look at grid data, we've got all of the same things. Not only does it show you how to do the typical get, put, delete stuff, but also how to do lookups. For example, we're using orders, and we've got an item from shippers in there. So how does it go and find the company name from the shipping object and so forth? So a lot of great things that you can reference code from. How do you data bind a chart? How do you data bind the pivot grid? So all of these great items are provided in this excellent sample gallery that I highly, highly recommend. All right, so let's get back to our slides here. We took a look at that sample. Now, just to recap, the Razor is rendered as a client-side widget. Now, what do you get by using this DevExtreme MVC wrapper? Well, all of the widgets, light semantic markup, as we said, Fluent syntax in MVC, tight integration with Web API, and you get support for Visual Studio 2012 through 2015. All those new technical demos that I just mentioned, the new set of documentation that I mentioned that we're also working on, and you get DevExpress's world-class support. So you get help from us at all if you get stuck at all. Now, on top of that, what's really, really, I think, interesting and nice is that we also provided for you, here, let's go back to the documentation here, the ability to use MVC3. We've compiled this against MVC3, meaning that it supports all the way back to MVC3 and later. And I'll talk about later in just a second. But you can be working in Visual Studio 2012 Update 5 and then still use all of this great features in case you're not ready to jump just yet to the latest Visual Studio. Now, let's talk about later. Speaking of later, that's basically ASP.NET Core. This is the latest from Microsoft. This is what the next generation of ASP.NET that Microsoft has been working on. And I'm happy to say that we support ASP.NET Core with our MVC wrappers. And you might say, wait a minute, Mehul, you've been talking about something called tag helpers. Yes, there's also a concept called tag helpers that we also provide. We've been providing those since earlier this year in January. So tag helpers are another option to use. And I'll talk about everything ASP.NET Core in an upcoming webinar. So if you're interested, this is the DevExtreme MVC Wrappers webinar, so I kind of want to focus on that. But I want to just quickly show you how this works. So I've got a sample, and you know, it's too much to get into in this webinar, but I'll definitely go into this sample in a future webinar. But if you take a look, I have set, for example, in fact, hold on one second. Let's go back to here, Visual Studio. Now, typically, you might run under IIS Express, but I'm going to actually run using their non-IIS server, which is that Kestrel server. This is the cross-platform server that works just about anywhere. Now, if you take a look at this, you can see that it brings up a command console and it's running this. So what exactly is this? Well, this is your typical Microsoft ASP.NET File New option, but we have changed the sample gallery that they provide with one of our DevExtreme galleries. And again, this is just to show you that it works, it's compiling, and we're working on some more. All right, finally, let me wrap it up by saying that this is a CTP. And the current status is that, you know, we've got it compiling against, you know, all these MVC options, including the new ASP.NET Core, but there's still things. The reason why it's a CTP is we're working on things like data annotations and validation. We're improving the story. We know there's some big things pieces that we still want to finish up. So don't worry, that is coming. In the meantime, please download 16.1. I want your feedback. I really want to know what it is that you are interested, what you like about this. Now, that said, I'll end this and say thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please let me know. With that, Amanda, I'll hand it back to you while we show some more funny tweets.
All right, Mehul, thank you. And we did have some questions that came in, but mainly the main one was when will DevExpress 16.1 be released? Which we can finally answer.
You know, Amanda, I can blame it on you, right? Amanda would not let us release it, but yesterday she said, you know, go for it. So it's available now, right, Amanda?
I'm a stickler for detail.
Yes.
It is available now. It was released yesterday. Are the example projects available also in VB?
I don't think so at the moment. Let me verify that. DevExtreme MVC. Let's see. Yeah, unfortunately, not at the moment. But ask us what it is that is not, how do I say it? We don't get this request a lot. So it's not that we don't like VB. I mean, you know, we have absolute fans of VB and in our company. But it's just that there's only so much time. In fact, you know, if we had more time, I would honestly tell you, I would ask those guys to, you know, finish something like data annotations first before I said, let's make VB. And it's nothing against VB. It's just that the large population of MVC customers who ask us questions tend to prefer C#. That's not anything against VB. We are absolutely going to provide that if there's a large customer base going, hey, we need this. But, you know, if you need help, ask us. Just ask our support. We'll find a way to help you. For now, though, let me verify so I don't make a liar out of those guys. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not available as a VB template, but it is available as C#, and we will try our absolute best to get that maybe in a future version or maybe by release. So right now, they got some things, and they're focusing on one language at a time.
From Pedro, does the template include an example with Bootstrap?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I'm sorry, Pedro, if I didn't highlight that properly. The template that I used absolutely uses Bootstrap out of default. So actually, that file new template I just showed you, this is it. And out of the box, it has Bootstrap. So let me rerun this again. But yeah, it's basically Bootstrap built right in. And if you'll notice here, I will go like this, and boom, you got the little Bootstrap menu as I collapse, expand, all that good stuff. So yes, Bootstrap is built right into that template, and the default DevExtreme theme is compatible with Bootstrap. And if you take a look at our DevExtreme webinar, if you go to YouTube, Developer Express, you will find the recent webinar that we just did. Yes, so the top results should be in Google here. But yeah, Amanda has put all the excellent webinars from the recent things in here. Or you can simply just go to videos. But the DevExtreme one that we did showed all of that stuff where Don and I talked about how Bootstrap is supported and how you can take a custom less file and even generate a theme for DevExtreme.
Great. And that's all the questions, Mehul.
Awesome.
All right, perfect. So everybody, you can check out devexpress.com/webinars for all of our previously recorded 16.1 launch webinars. They are at the bottom of the webpage, or you can, of course, go to our YouTube channel. I posted that link in the chat box. Coming up, June 28th, we have Using DevExtreme with TypeScript and Angular with CTO Julian Bucknell and Technical Evangelist Paul Usher. And on July 12th, get notified with DevExtreme Mobile. Join Paul and Julian again as they show you how to add push notifications to a DevExtreme mobile app. The presentation will show how to harness the flexibility of Microsoft Azure and the cross-platform power of DevExtreme Mobile to take your apps to a new level. So you can register for both of those today. And again, like I mentioned previously, today's webinar will be posted on our DevExpress YouTube channel so you can re-watch it at your convenience. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Mehul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.